This week's Gaming the Podcast is all about Capcom, a developer and publisher that has just had a simply wonderful time recently releasing hit after hit, particularly across their primary franchises of Resident Evil, Street Fighter, Monster Hunter, and Devil May Cry. I'm John Robertson, and I'll be joined shortly by Stace Harmon to talk about what has made these franchises work so well for Capcom and discuss how the company has now put itself back at the very top tier of game development. If you'd like to join the conversation, then do get in touch with us on Twitter. We are at IndieByDesign. That's at IndieByDesign. And while you're there, you'll also find a link to our Discord server. And if you'd like to support the show, then please do consider picking yourself up a copy of one of our video game books. You can find out all about those at indiebydesign.net. Now, let's get on with discussing Capcom.
Recently, I've been playing a lot of Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection on Switch, which manages to retain the very brutal difficulty of the 90s original. I remember playing, I think it was on Mega Drive. I remember playing that a long time ago. But it's been updated in several interesting ways, and Capcom has done, I think, a very good job of retaining the essence of that original game and making it palatable and playable, whilst also still being very difficult. For modern audiences. So it does things like there's an ability tree of sorts. You can unlock kind of magic special powers that you have slots for, and you can use those in the levels. There's also a branching level system where if you're banging your head against a brick wall for a while, you can then try a different branch of the level. Like there's basically two different 1-1s, for example. So you can pick the one that suits you depending on what kind of challenges you're equipped to deal with. There's pretty generous checkpointing, there is infinite lives, and yet despite all of that, I've spent a lot of time, like each life might only be 20 or 30 seconds on the hardest difficulty, which has resulted in me being humble and going down difficulties in order to make any sort of progress. But all of it in total kind of sums up for me how Capcom has taken that franchise and thought about how to make it work in 2021. And that, I think, speaks to something that Capcom appears to be very good at, which is it seems to be able to have periods of self-reflection where it looks at its franchises and is able to assess what made them great in the first place and retain that essence whilst also doing a good job of updating them. And probably Resident Evil 7 is a very good example of that. After the low point of 6, Capcom went away and thought a lot about that and made sure that 7 went back to the roots of the series. And we talked about this somewhat in like the 25th anniversary episode of Resident Evil on the podcast. But yeah, they seem to be, for the most part, a company that is able to take care and curate their own franchises very well, whilst not losing that original essence of them. And they've been around for, they are an enduring developer and publisher. They've been around for a long time. So what are you play more Monster Hunter than I do, for example. So what, does that fit with your experience of Capcom, your view of Capcom as being a company that is able to retain the identity of its franchises whilst also just making them good, basically?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I think it does that. So I'd consider Capcom as having. They're pretty much a franchise studio at this point, aren't they? Mm-hmm. Like they rarely do a fully original game. I know they do occasionally, but it is very occasionally at this point. But their franchises. What they do with their franchises is really clever and really good, and they just rarely make a bad game anymore. Like I know that they release a huge number of games. They release the games on phones and tablets and stuff, and I can't claim to have played all of those. But of their main quote unquote main games. They always score well, they sell pretty well. I enjoy them, and yeah, I think a lot of that is that they take care of their franchises, like you say. So I mean, Monster Hunter Worlds adds full online systems, and that's sort of how irritating they can be once you're actually in them and playing and everyone's in there. It works really well and it's really good, and it does change the gameplay a lot, but also retains that core Monster Hunter vibe. Rise is a bit more kind of aimed at players who don't necessarily like the changes in Monster Hunter world. So, you know, here you go, here's a different game in the same series aimed at someone slightly different. But then I guess the most obvious examples is the recent Resident Evil games, Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 2 and 3 remake. Both show that real love and respect to both the franchise and the audience in how well and how much care they've taken in developing those games.
And an understanding of them, right? Again, of both of those things, of their franchises and an understanding of the audience as well. So
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, Resident Evil 2 feels like Resident Evil 2 in a lot of ways, but it also feels completely new in other ways. I know people didn't like Resident Evil 3 as much, but I thought Resident Evil 3 remake was brilliant as well. Yes, more action focused. Yes, bit easier. Yes, very short, but you know, it's fine. It was brilliant. I really love that. And then Resident Evil 7, you know, the disaster that was Resident Evil 6, all the way back in 2012. You know, they took 5 years off and they came back with Resident Evil 7, which is a brilliant game. And they've made that modern by, like we spoke about this in previous episodes, but, you know, they made that modern by going back to, well, they made that nostalgic by going back to Resident Evil 1's sort of house style, sort of confined locations and sort of maze-like design. But then they made it fresh enough with a new character, first-person camera, obviously all the visual and technical stuff as well. But yeah, like I just can't think in the last however many years, I don't know, pick a number, like 5 years or whatever, in their main franchises, which I would say are Resident Evil, Monster Hunter, Street Fighter, Devil May Cry. They just nailed them, absolutely nailed them. Yeah. Like I can't think of there aren't many franchises that are in a stronger position than those at the moment. And like, you know, whenever a new game in those series is released, everyone is buzzed for it. Everyone's like, well, not everyone, but you know, their fans are buzzed for it. Like they like, yes, I can't wait to play that.
And that's not to say that they don't. I mean, they do, of course, they do put a foot wrong here and there. The launch of Street Fighter V felt like a big step backwards from where 4 had ended, or had ended up. And then it went to 5, and that felt like a big step back, particularly if you were playing single player. That was, I think, maybe an experiment. There was a sort of an experiment in, well, looking around and seeing what things like shooters are doing. Maybe Call of Duty's splitting out its single player and its multiplayer, so maybe we can do a similar thing. Maybe there isn't the appetite for the single player. But there has been an effort to adapt that. And I think it's easy to be quite dismissive. I mean, you know, sometimes you see it with companies who promise something. I'm thinking something like No Man's Sky, but what is delivered isn't initially out the gate the thing that people were expecting, or even that they like that much. And then to go back and work on that and keep working on it until it's been brought up to a level that is far more acceptable and palatable. It does, I think there should be some consideration and some well, credit where it's due, basically, and that's, I think, what Capcom have done with Street Fighter V, which, yeah, that's that. There's been constant tweaks and constant balancing, and that's probably not surprising because they have an entire, you know, they have an entire tournament circuit built on this game. It's not like they're just putting it out there into the wild and people can enjoy it or not enjoy it. There is a certain expectation, and they're building a kind of almost a separate brand off of it. So it behooves them to continue to tweak it, but it feels like it's done in the spirit of a lot of those other franchises, where there is a willingness to listen and to understand and to re-examine, and not just say it is what it is. Get on with it. And the Resident Evil remakes that you mentioned there, I think they have that, I don't know if there's an actual word for it, but that kind of strange semi-nostalgia, that almost faux nostalgia thing of, yes, it feels like the original. It almost feels like how you remember the original to feel when you first played it. And this is what they've done with Ghosts and Goblins. Like it feels like the original, even though there's so many different changes, but those updates and changes that have been made have been made in order to make it feel like the original. It's like, well, we need to make allowances for all of these changes that have happened in the design space over the last couple of decades and still somehow tap into that original feel. Whereas something perhaps like Medieval is another game that I kind of compare from around the same kind of era that was still the most recent Medieval game was good, but not as successfully like retaining the core essence of what it once was and bringing it up to date in a meaningful way. So I think it takes a certain level of willingness to listen and think about how to achieve something rather than just chasing trends or fashions.
Yeah, well, I think that's the key. Like, they really do seem to understand what is at the core of why people enjoy their franchises. So they can, because sometimes it's hard. So like, that sounds like such an obvious thing to say. Of course, a creator understands what's good about it, but sometimes they don't. Like, sometimes they can only see it from their development perspective or the marketing perspective. And they can't see the wood for the trees, really. They can't see what the opposite view of this thing is. You know, they're behind their side of the fence and they don't really understand the other side of the fence, the player side. But Capcom really do seem to understand it. And I think they've been quite smart as well. Like, they seem to have limited themselves in terms of quantity of franchises that they're now focusing on. And that does seem to have improved quality quite a bit. Like the last fall, they've got other franchises. They've got Ace Attorney, they got Phoenix Wright, which, hasn't had a game for a while. Marvel vs. Capcom hasn't had a game for a while. Darkstalkers, there's some other ones, I'm sure, but Lost Planet, Mega Man. And I'm sure, these franchises are not dead, I'm sure. Well, Lost Planet might be. But I think it's really smart. Like, the games that and now they've gotten to this phase in their sort of life cycle where they are now known for quality, and it's kind of snuck up a bit. Like, it's not like they sort of put the flag down and was like, we're now really good again. It's just slowly been this cultural shift, I suppose, from within the company. And so like, I don't claim to know like the internal politics or what's happened, but someone will have said like that, enough is enough. Like, we need to stop just releasing all of these games that are getting, mediocre review scores. We're relying on releasing a lot of games that are selling okay in order so that our total sales are big enough so that we can continue with our status and making the games that we want to make. They really seem to have concentrated their development. So yeah, I don't know what's happened internally, but it's interesting to see that just from the results perspective.
And that, like you said, it is something that is kind of the thing that when you start thinking about it more than just knowing, oh yeah, Capcom have been doing this for a while, it's that you stop and think about what their recent releases have been over that last 5 or 6 year period, and then it becomes evident, having looked at like the catalogue of releases, rather than it just being a known thing. Like, there's a period of reflection that then leads to that. And that's what's happened for me with like Ghosts and Goblins. It started with playing that and appreciating that, and then thinking, well, actually they've been doing this for a little while. They've been taking care of these things, and having that back catalogue to tap into as well. Like, they Capcom of the 90s, I have a very, there's a certain games companies that in the 1990s I have very fond memories of, and like Capcom and Konami were another one. And they have those games like that are of the era. So they have things like Mega Man and Ghosts and Goblins and Final Fight as well. And Street Fighter 2 is almost its own thing, Street Fighter 2 specifically, and the variations of that. But then they have like these franchises that are like span eras. So the Street Fighter franchise as a whole is that, but also Resident Evil and Monster Hunter, and and Devil May Cry as well. And it's not a thing. It's not one of those instances where oh yeah, this series used to be good, or this series was, yeah, like it had its heyday, and now it's kind of, it just didn't keep up. The developer didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know how to make it relevant or current. They've managed broadly to do that across multiple franchises, and it doesn't mean, and they are also quite eclectic, I think, because it doesn't mean that just because you like one Capcom franchise that you're going to like all of them by any means. It's that, I don't have as much interest in Monster Hunter, and I would say that I found the whole experience in Monster Hunter World of trying to get online and play with somebody to be just kind of baffling. I didn't understand why it was so complicated. It just seemed like as a new player to the franchise who's heard a lot about this and I want to come in and experience it, it didn't seem like it was geared towards me as that new player. But I understand that the game underneath it is very strong and has been very well received. But it was like, okay, well, maybe Monster Hunter Rise is perhaps more something that I'd look towards. So again, we're not claiming that Capcom don't make odd choices sometimes or haven't had missteps or controversies in their past, but they do have a very strong suite of releases, particularly for a developer of that era. And going back even further into the early 80s with like a lot of their arcade games, that's where they originated, a lot of their arcade games. They have just, lots of games that you can name from your childhood that it's likely that you favoured a Capcom franchise somewhere along the line. It holds a special place.
Well, they take a lot of risks, and I'd argue that they still probably take risks now. I think even Resident Evil 7 going first person wasn't definitely going to work, although they definitely need to try something after Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil Revelations as well, episodic release, that wasn't definitely going to work. DMC Devil May Cry wasn't that long ago. That was massive risk, and I think for most people that paid off. I liked that game. It was okay. It's more than okay. That's been a bit high. It's more than okay. It was a good game. Wasn't stunning. And I guess its quality was its actual quality was kind of shown up by how good Devil May Cry 5 was. So yeah, they do take risk, and they don't just sit on their laurels. Like, even though they're working with these big, very revered within gaming, very revered street franchises. I guess only Street Fighter and Resident Evil, I suppose, as well, outside of gaming, are ones that people would have heard of. I don't think that many outside of gaming. I don't think, Monster Hunter or Devil May Cry have really bridged the gap to mainstream non-gaming public like Street Fighter and Resident Evil have.
No, although it does have a film. I mean, that has happened.
That terrible film.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, video game films is a whole other podcast episode, I think. But and Resident Evil obviously had a string of very commercially successful, if not critically particularly well received.
Various anime and stuff as well for Resident Evil. So they do take risks, and I guess, I don't know, I wonder if now is the time for them to take some more risks now that they've re-established themselves as like a tier 1 sort of like super developer. I wonder if now is the time. Well, or just bring back some of the ones that have kind of been lost a bit. Like, I'm thinking like Beautiful Joe. Mm-hmm. They've got loads of beat 'em ups like Darkstalkers, Power Stone.
Power Stone, yeah. I mean, I could definitely get on board with the new Power Stone, because I always favoured Power Stone over. I kind of never moved on from Power Stone onto things like Smash Brothers or that, which I think was much later. But I never really moved. That wasn't a natural evolution for me. So I would definitely happily go back and play, or not go back, but I would definitely play another Power Stone if that was created. And
Dead Rising is still kind of in that. The last Dead Rising game wasn't that long ago. To be honest, I never loved the Dead Rising games that much, although I know that some people really did adore them.
That was another thing they took risks with the whole like timed event thing, and you could only, if you missed there was a time of day element in the original Dead Rising that if you missed certain events, or if you were somewhere else when something happened, it just happened. That I think it got a bit of pushback on, and I don't know how much of that is like it being a design issue versus just that's not how we're used to playing games. We're not used to this notion of things happening in our absence. We're used to being the driving force in any given game world, and things can only progress when I say they can, or when I'm there reacting to what I'm doing, rather than just, me having to be in a certain place at a certain time. So, yeah, and Beautiful Joe, and I mean, Akami as well.
Akami, yeah.
Very well critically received, not particularly commercially successful, although...
It's destined for HD remasters.
Yeah, to Capcom's credit, they
again.
have basically put it on every possible platform that they could, in a hope that it would find an audience. And, it's very fondly remembered. It's not... When they have taken those risks... And as you said earlier, there are many, many other games they've released that I'm sure have been garbage and that haven't worked out. And, people can bring up whole lists of games where these experiments or risks didn't pay off. But they have had these big tentpole franchises, and then they've had these big, not massively successful, but very well thought of, more experimental franchises like Beautiful Joe, Akami, and Ace Attorney is a thing unto itself. And they also managed to bridge that gap for the most part between that kind of typical Eastern Western divide that is, I don't know if it's perhaps talked about more than it is actually a thing, but they're a Japanese company that is huge in Japan, and to the point that they did things like they handled the localization and the publishing of the God of War series, and apparently did a very good job of it. They didn't just put their logo on the box and push it out the door. They hired local actors. They made sure that it was done well. And so they've kind of acted as this bridge between the two. And then they've taken some of their big franchises and tried to, like Monster Hunter, and done things. I don't know that it's necessarily to appease a Western audience, but I guess it's that consideration again. They have considered what things work, where can things be tweaked to but still retain the essence of the original franchise without just making it a completely Western game and losing its identity.
Yeah, and then on the other side of the coin to that, they have funded Western developers to make games for them. So, like, the DMC Devil May Cry is that. But Remember Me as well. You play that?
Yeah.
That was a pretty good game. That was a very interesting game. I wouldn't say, like, everyone rush out and play it, but it is a very interesting game to kind of think about what they were trying to do with that. And I suppose Capcom aren't alone in being a Japanese company who have hired or just outright bought up Western games developers. I mean, Sega have done it to a phenomenal degree. Sega seem to be buying up a huge amount of, or at least publishing a huge amount of Western games. So yeah, I suppose that was a cultural shift for them a bit earlier than this. Let's just concentrate on these core franchises and see how we go. So yeah, they are clearly open to learning, I suppose, and evolving.
Evolving and adapting.
Rather than just, because it can be very easier to just sort of stay on your track and just carry on doing whatever it was that you were doing before, and just hoping that the world adapts or sticks with you, rather than you working really hard to adapt and move to where the world's going. And I don't think that's something that all games developers have achieved. Certainly some Japanese ones.
Well, yeah, like one of Capcom's stablemates in the 90s was Konami, and I don't know that they've had that same... Well, I mean, it's not that I don't know. They haven't had that same success in adapting or wanting to or being willing to, or whatever the internal politics are at Konami, and with Kojima as well. That's another big name from the 90s that hasn't made it.
You can almost look at those two companies as a case study, and they had a similar sort of established brand in PS1 era. Konami predominantly, riding on Metal Gear Solid, Capcom Resident Evil, and now look at them.
Yeah.
I mean, Konami are, let's just say they're not exactly flying, and Capcom Capcom really are. Like, I think genuinely, like, whenever Capcom release a new game now or announce a new game or whatever, like, I'm genuinely interested to see what's happening with it, even though you know that it's probably going to be a franchise that you've played before. But you just don't know how they're going to take it, and they're quite good at making. Even though they're doing franchises, they're not just following. The way that they make their franchises relevant isn't just by copying what other games do. They do stick quite firmly. This goes back to like understanding the essence of their games. They do stick quite firmly to what it is that have made their games successful in the past. So I'm thinking Devil May Cry didn't come out too long apart from the new God of War, the newest God of War. They're both, on the surface of them, they're both action RPGs. But whereas God of War has moved into, like, brilliantly, like, it's done a great job of moving into this more open world, more heavier on the RPG side and the leveling up and exploration and sort of pushing yourself through the world. This kind of semi-open world style that a lot of action games adhere to now. Devil May Cry doesn't do that. Devil May Cry sticks doggedly, firmly to, here's a single level. There's going to be a start and end. You're going to get a rating at the end of the level. You're going to get a certain amount of bloods that you're going to use to level up, and that's all you can do. And the level's going to take 45 minutes or half an hour or an hour. And there you go. Come back. We'll see you next time. Oh, you want to redo that level to try and beat your score? Like, go for it. Like,
it feels more rooted in their arcade roots. That notion of a beginning, middle, and end, a score, far more than sort of an open world style or a semi-open world style would be.
Yeah. Well, I think that means that Devil May Cry can sit brilliantly alongside some of these other games, like, because you play God of War for that. As an action game, for that wide open, more sort of emergent combat, I suppose, and to have a more diverse gameplay experience. I'll do a bit of this, and I'll do a bit of that, and then I'll do a bit of this, all in the same game. Whereas Devil May Cry is no, like, this is it. You're going to go into a level, and it's going to be pretty obvious where you've got to go all the time. And here's an arena that will literally shut until you've beat everyone, and then it'll open up again. So the games sit nicely. So Devil May Cry can sit nicely with people who like to play things like God of War as well, because you know what you're going to get from Devil May Cry. Like, you can play God of War for your 4 or 5 hour exploratory session, and then almost relax in the comfort of the constraints of Devil May Cry. Like, you know what you're going to get for that hour of gameplay. And of course, it just allows them to design brilliantly conceived gameplay sequences in that as well, because you know exactly what the player's going to be facing. So it's all about just giving that, that purity of the single design concept. So I think they've been really smart in that, and that feels kind of old school and nostalgic in a really sort of warm embrace kind of way.
It's this like faux nostalgia thing where it almost feels like the way that you remember it to be when you first played it, but it isn't that, because they've also done a lot to modernize and update the design so that it isn't jarring, so that it isn't that, you go back to it and, oh wow, this just feels really old fashioned and rubbish. It feels fresh, but it is kind of reassuringly familiar at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the thing that links all of these, that links Street Fighter, Devil May Cry, Resident Evil, Monster Hunter, is that they do all have, to greater or lesser degrees, they all have this absolutely crazy, blown out sense of character, sense of world. The dialogue is like off the charts of like B-movie dialogue. Like Devil May Cry does it in that very spectacular, like these are just ridiculous superheroes sort of way. Resident Evil 7 does it in this is the most silly horror movie you've ever played. Like there's a car chase inside a garage in Resident Evil 7. Like you get your arm cut off, your wrist cut off, and then you just glue it back or you stitch it back on and you're fine.
Yeah.
In Monster Hunter World, you go to that hub area, and like everything's crazy, and there's a giant monster about to come, and there's people wearing all of this like sort of Flintstones, like weird like stuff, armor that would never work, or would offer no protection, and just be ridiculously heavy. So they've all got that kind of that. And then Street Fighter, obviously, like the characters, the linking of even the character designs themselves, but the stories that link them are just absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. So they've all got that sense of playfulness, I suppose, like because the stories do have themes that are kind of can be philosophical if you look deep enough, but they're playful. That's playful, mainly what they are,
and they are cheesy. But I wonder, like, I feel like for me anyway, that cheesiness in a different game would just be outright bad writing and voice acting. But because what underpins them is a quality experience, I can be kind of far more forgiving of it, and almost it's affectionate. It's almost I expect it and I want that. I almost want at that level of nonsense to go along with what is a very good game. But if the game, and that you can't, I don't know that you can do that without having built up the trust. Well, I mean, Resident Evil 1 was certainly no stranger to that kind of acting, and yet the game itself was so good that it carried it. But yeah, in a game that's just bad, it's like that just adds to the badness of it. That's not charming. It's just like, what is this? This is just terrible. But
well, I'm thinking, so I guess like No More Heroes is an example of that, where it's most people think that's also done pretty well, but it's something more kind of audience splitting, I guess, would be like Lollipop Chainsaw, or Shadow of the Damned. Although I like both of those games as well. So yeah, I don't know. I do. Yeah, in general, just like that sense of silliness.
Yeah, Lollipop Chainsaw feels like it's one of those projects, and I say projects because I think that can also encompass other media, where the context in which it's created, or what the creators are trying to do, and the director specifically is trying to do, it can be quite easily lost because it looks like another example of just a standard kind of typical video game fare with a cheerleader wielding a chainsaw, and it looks like a lot of other video games, not in the specificity of its aesthetic that there's a cheerleader wielding a chainsaw, but just in that what the purpose of that is for, who that's for, what it's meant to be saying in having that. And I think if you are willing to look into it and kind of understand what, like, the people that created it and why it was created, you come away with a different feel than if you just go into it blind and look at it and it's like, well, this is patently ridiculous. Well, the game is a satire. It's just hard to do. It's hard to do satire in video games because everything looks like it must be a satire because it's so ridiculous.
Well, yeah, and also because it's hard to satire something in which and it's hard to say this is ridiculous and this is dumb and this is silly, but then also ask the player to engage in that thing and be like, take it seriously as a gameplay concept, because the only way you're going to see the satire is by engaging with it and being it. So it's hard, but I think Capcom sort of stay on the right side. I'm not going to say that Lollipop Chainsaw is the wrong side of that, but it stays on the more forgiving and sort of easier to access side of that kind of writing. Like it doesn't tempt things too far, because I mean, there are readings of Resident Evil 7 that could be quite serious, that are quite serious, but then it's also got a guy that chases you around in a car inside a garage, and a guy who's Lucas, who clearly just loves Jigsaw from the Saw movies. So it's got the ridiculousness to it as well. But I guess it's just, they tread a fine line on that writing and that sort of vibe of their games, just like they tread a fine line on bringing back nostalgic gameplay elements with new ones. They try to find line with what franchises to keep close and really focus on, and then the ones that they sort of have either dropped or keep on the back burner. They've I don't know, they've walked a tightrope in the last few years and gotten to the other side pretty successfully, I'd say. Come and let us know your thoughts on Capcom via Twitter. We are at Indie by Design. And once again, like I said at the start, we do have a Discord server that we've just set up, which you can find via our Twitter account. So come and join that too. Also, if you like the show, then it'd be hugely appreciated if you could leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, as it really, really does help us reach new people. So any kind of spreading the word would be fantastic. Otherwise, thank you again for listening, and we'll be back next week.